We're supposed to learn from our own mistakes, but other people's errors can be instructive too. From efforts to control the weather that went disastrously awry to the untimely death of the Segway boss, history is a treasure trove of mishaps and meltdowns that can teach us all. I'm Tim Harford, host of Cautionary Tales, the podcast that mines the greatest fiascos of the past for their most valuable lessons. Listen to Cautionary Tales wherever you get your podcasts.
Beneath a vast, cloudless sky in the serene New Mexico desert, a man emerges from a rustic clay home. A persistent heat beats down on the intense red landscape. It's the year 2000, and Don Redman, Mark Lombardi's old friend, is the artist in residence and custodian of a mud brick house. It's the former home of artist Georgia O'Keeffe, which harmoniously blends in with the natural surroundings. Don's life has moved on. He's left Houston and become a father, starting afresh in New Mexico, which is why what happens next is even more surprising.
I ran into Dave Barlow, and it was kind of shocking.
It's been a few years since Don last saw Mark and his wife, Day. She looks older, a little tired. Then she blurts it out.
She said, Mark and I got a divorce, and Mark's moved to New York. And I was like, well, what's going on? Because Day and I were kind of friends. I mean, I know he totally loved Day. I'm curious why he even went to New York.
Don doesn't know what to say, but Day keeps talking anyway. The couple that were always a little unusual have finally succumbed to the pressure of difference. Day's corporate job supporting them, her disinterest in Mark's work, and his growing obsessions with the power brokers of the world, the bankers, the Bush dynasty, even the Bin Ladens.
One day Mark came to me when he and his wife were splitting up, and he handed me a bunch of little micro cassettes off an answering machine.
Mark even had a secret job, which Day likely had no idea about, but that he shared with his close friends, like Andy Feehan.
They were conversations that he had secretly recorded with his wife and some guy talking. And I was just like, Mark, oh no. I don't want this, it's none of my business. And he said, yeah, well, I've been doing private eye stuff, and so this is part of what I do.
Mark has been snooping on Day, and he's found something.
The way I remember it, she was cheating on him with a Houston cop, and that didn't go over too well.
But their marriage, already straining under the stress of Mark's obsessions and his lack of commercial success, has already collapsed.
A story perhaps that had some dark passages to it.
He did know how to fix it. He said, I want to, but I don't know how. So I think at some point he just said, I'm going to choose one or the other, and I guess he chose art.
That is really where I get a buzz. That is where my energy is renewed every day.
For the first time in his life, aged 45, has Mark Lombardi committed to what makes him happy? Or has he finally been swallowed by his obsessions? Elegant drawings visualizing the hidden architecture of power, money, and influence.
He let the work speak for itself. Nobody was making art like this, and they still haven't. Nobody's made work like this.
And it's his commitment that sets in motion the making of the man we know today. Mark doesn't know it yet, but his years of toiling as a struggling researcher are about to come to an end.
And this is my way of coping with dealing with it.
For better or worse.
I don't want to say it was an overnight success, but things started happening really, really, really fast for him.
This is The Illuminator, Art, Conspiracy, and Madness. The story of conceptual artist Mark Lombardi's rise to fame, whose brilliant genius had devastating consequences. I'm Akko Mitchell, and this is Episode 4, The Mother of All Bank Scandals. New York City, the place where Mark Lombardi would succeed and achieve the recognition he craved most.
Mark Lombardi had to survive, and he did what he had to do.
He's living in a tiny loft apartment, no more than 500 square feet, on the south side of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, a loft advertised on the Village Voice classifieds. His friend Irv Tepper is horrified.
The living situation was horrible, I thought. I couldn't live in that place that he was living in. It was like this smallish place, like it was a warehouse. It was like divided off. These windows that led to a 24-hour car wash place where they're playing blasting Puerto Rican music. You know, that's what I remember. I can't imagine going home to that.
In the shadow of his failed marriage and ill-fated galleries, many of Mark's friends advise him against moving to New York, including Irv, who lives in Manhattan.
So I knew what that kind of life was like, but I didn't know how long he could sustain it.
But Mark ignores them. New York promises greater recognition than ever.
I was never thoroughly satisfied with it.
He's found his purpose.
I think by the time Mark moved to New York, he was thinking of himself as an artist and had this tremendous approval and interest in his work.
I mean, I enjoy doing them. It allows you to almost to walk into the narrative in a way that this doesn't, and I find that very appealing, and I think that the stories are conducive to that. They're very expansive.
Mark is deliberate with his plan. Even the building he lives in turns out to be owned by Judy Pfaff, the pioneer of installation art. One of his neighbors is the sculptor Ursula von Rittingsvert.
He already had it in his head that he wanted to do it. And I was like, are you sure? You know, because New York is complicated.
Mark's friend, Fred Tomaselli, senses his excitement to join a vibrant art movement that is responding to the social, economic, and political changes of the era.
And he was like, yeah, no, I really want to get out of Houston. I didn't really so much encourage him to move to New York as try to be helpful to him should he make that decision. And he did.
Mark's intentionally surrounding himself with the flow of information and inspiration he needs to succeed. The risk pays off, and quickly, as his friends witness, among them the artist Billy Hassel.
He was getting shows, he was getting recognized, you know, there was interest in his work in New York, and he was happier than I'd ever seen him.
I was searching for a vehicle that would have the graphic impact of a painting, but could convey a story, narrative information.
He was looking for something beyond what most artists I knew at the time were doing. And I think that, you know, when things finally started to click for him, I think that had to have been a very satisfying time in his life for, you know, a brief period.
Mark Lombardi is surrounded by people at the prestigious Drawing Center in Manhattan. It's a museum and gallery dedicated to the one thing Mark excels at: drawings, unique works on paper, as a major art form. It's almost like it's meant to be, had Mark not so painstakingly worked his way up to this point. Rafael Vargas Suarez is spellbound by the attention on Mark.
And I just remember being at the opening. It was just amazing to hear what people had to say, and they were just so curious.
Mark's best works are all there on display. The exhibit is called Selections, Winter 1997.
it would draw you in. You really had to study it, you know? So that was fascinating to see.
Kathy Hurd, who hosted Mark's wedding reception, is among the large group of friends and family rallying around him.
The Drawing Center was a really big deal in that era because it showcased things like Mark's work, which were not paintings, weren't oil or watercolors or whatever, they were truly drawings and diagrams.
Mark had worked for years, all in a small, lonely room, channeling a massive inventory of facts to turn them into what he called narrative structures. Each drawing told a story about an event that interested him, like the collapse of a big bank. Mark's hunger for information drove him, but the promise of an audience, of attention, that was what made him come alive.
I was more interested in listening, eavesdropping in on people's comments about the work, everybody reading all those little names, and it was just fascinating to see how people who didn't know Mark, perhaps, were reacting to the work.
Raphael met Mark for the first time in 1997, on a job moving and installing art in New York City. That night at the Drawing Center, he meets Mark's parents, Shirley and Don.
I do remember him saying to me that his parents were really against the idea of him being an artist because nobody in his family was creative at all. When Mark attained a level of success, his parents did come to town, and I think they were very proud of him eventually.
And Mark is more himself than he's ever been. Funny, charismatic, and oozing confidence. People are drawn to Mark, to the thing he has always wanted to create, a personality, a legacy, more so than even his drawings.
He wasn't really after the money. The fame was definitely more of the issue. From day one, you could tell he was hungry, really hungry to make it. He was already, I think, in his 40s. He hadn't tasted it. Now he wanted it.
I'm sure that was a part of it as well. Starting over at almost age 50, it's pretty tough. And then you go do it in New York City. To try to make it as an artist. It's like all these things are just so stacked against you. I remember when Mark said, well, I can just draw now. I'm so happy I can just draw now.
And the audience for Mark's conceptual art doesn't diminish. He goes on to have successful solo exhibitions in New York, including one at the Pierogi Gallery in Brooklyn, run by Joe Amrine and Susan Swenson.
He actually walked into the gallery, and at the time the gallery had an open door policy where artists would come in and show their work. He didn't show a lot at that time, but he talked about the work, which was very interesting, and then we made a schedule of visits to come in with more of his accomplished work, and totally blew me away.
It's a fortuitous meeting, and Mark, bolstered by his recent success, makes a great first impression.
He came across as a heartfelt personality that was honest and straightforward. When I talk to artists or look at artwork, it's always interesting how the artist talks about the work. Mark, of course, his work is all information-based. It's not about emotional aspects or spiritual aspects or things like that. It's more mental and straightforward information.
Pretty soon after he meets Joe, the Pierogi Gallery put on a show of Mark's work called Silent Partners, named after the so-called silent characters that make up the bulk of Mark's diagrams, the businessmen and institutions who shy away from the headlines and are rarely held accountable. Susan Swenson, who runs the Pierogi with Joe, is astonished by the level of detail.
He always said everything that was in his drawings was public information. It was very difficult to put together when you have all the information scattered in all these different places, and he really visualized it. For most of us normal people who read all these things and can't keep all the pieces together, he made it visual.
We'll be back after this short break.
Rosemont police say an intentional chlorine gas leak has sent 19 people to the hospital.
You're telling me that there was a terrorist attack in 2014 involving the use of chemical weapons, but nobody heard about it?
This could not have been an accident.
People were eager to assume that it was some sort of hate attack.
I've gone through all the theories. I think there's only one that fits.
Yeah, you have to read this story.
Fear and Loathing, out now on Amazon Music.
Mark is finally getting a small dose of the recognition he craves, and he can start to consider quitting the jobs he's had to put up with to keep a roof over his head. He's surrounded by the emerging creatives of the New York art scene. Most are half his age, ambitious and rebellious. Then, at the Armory Show at the Gramercy Park Hotel, a who's who of the New York art scene, he meets someone.
I was immediately drawn to him.
Hilary Maslin, a fellow artist. The connection is instantaneous.
He was lively, and I was attracted to him, and he had kind of like a groundedness in his maleness. You know, it was kind of Texas-like, you know. I think there was definitely a spark.
It's an intense bond. Mark instantly wants to tell her everything, chain smoking through his words.
In the case here, again, of our Kissinger associates, I want to show the relationship.
I mean, he could really talk about a lot of things, art history. He was really brilliant, but it could be a little bit too much, you know, just so much information. It was overwhelming.
Hilary is experiencing what many of Mark's closest friends, like Raphael, know all too well. His tendency to fixate on a subject and never let it go.
He would sometimes ask me a really funny question, a very almost cryptic or coded question. Like he would say, "Hey, are you a fan of the Slurk?" And I thought it was like, that sounds like a band or some show, a movie, or like, I don't even know what you're talking about.
But what his new girlfriend and young artist followers don't realize is Mark's intense fixations don't just inspire and challenge them to think differently.
And he would tell me the names of some CIA operatives or some general from some, you know, military dictatorship from Cambodia or something. And I was like, well, you know, why are you asking me? He's like, well, you need to know because it might affect you. So he was always asking me, like, do you know about this? Do you know about that? It was like this very multidimensional kind of reasoning behind it. I always felt like he would ask me these things almost like saying to me, you gotta be aware of how fucked up the world is.
The closer people get to Mark, the more they see that his obsessions do not just underlie a paranoid man searching for answers, but someone close to putting a finger on the biggest controversies in American history.
Some weird stuff happened.
And it starts to scare them.
We were hanging out together at a loft on the 13th floor in Hell's Kitchen. He had parked down on the street. He had a little truck, and somebody slammed into it when it was parked. And I think he thought that was intentional.
At first, Hilary laughs it off, reassures him it was an accident bound to happen in one of the busiest cities on Earth. But then a few weeks later, Hilary is with Mark in his apartment when a dark shadow falls over the room. Outside, a black orb is suspended in the sky.
A blimp was hanging right outside of our window, so there was like this little sense of being, you know, watched. I mean, he was definitely under surveillance.
Okay. So it was a female FBI agent. I don't know her name. I only know that she contacted his gallery, Pierogi Gallery in Brooklyn, and also contacted the Whitney Museum, which owns the work they wanted to see, the BCCI piece.
Robert Hobbs, an art historian and curator, knows exactly why the FBI wanted to see the BCCI piece, his crowning achievement.
Well, she was interested in the money. She wanted to know how Osama bin Laden was able to get the money and distribute the money.
The work's precise title is a series of acronyms: BCCI, ICIC, FAB. It stands for Bank of Credit and Commerce International, International Credit and Investment Corporation, and First American Bank Shares. It is the culmination of every other work Mark has ever done, the scale and complexity of which is unmatched. A beautiful unraveling of the dirtiest bank in the world, a financial institution where Osama bin Laden held multiple accounts and whose employees went on to work for Al-Qaeda.
The BCCI drawing, which is 52 by 140, has like 300 elements. I went through 6 pencils doing that one drawing.
And the FBI agent has located it on the 2nd floor of the Whitney Museum of American Art, where Maxwell Anderson was director at the time. The FBI have found something so threatening held within this drawing that the government will go to great lengths to censor it.
The idea that someone could simply ask for a work of art to be removed from a gallery, to me, would only be if it was a function of danger, immediate danger to the public.
The FBI want to take Mark's drawing.
Presumably to inspect it, to examine it, to put it through their forensic examination, and whatever else they might have been seeking, including presumably invisible ink or anything that their forensic team might have wanted to have access to it for.
But Maxwell and the team at the Whitney refused to release the drawing, which remains in storage there to this day.
It suggested that he had touched a nerve, obviously, and that at a time when, as today, the FBI is deeply connected to corridors of unseen power, I assumed that there was someone in the tradition of J. Edgar Hoover who was obsessed and worried about how a creative person could create harm in the United States by simply expressing themselves.
In his pursuit of truth, Mark had uncovered a profound fact. Osama bin Laden had held a number of accounts with BCCI, notably the name Khalid bin Mahfouz, a Saudi billionaire banker and former BCCI director, appears on the drawing. Khalid held a 30% stake in the bank, and following the 9/11 terror attacks, considerable suspicion fell on him and other Saudi financiers for their alleged bankrolling of Al-Qaeda. The bank collapsed in 1991, having more than earned its nickname, the Bank of Crooks and Criminals. Exposed for facilitating mass financial crime, it had never discriminated when it came to its clientele. All of the most notorious criminals had accounts open there, from Saddam Hussein to the Medellin Cartel, run by none other than Pablo Escobar. The FBI sees the web of uncomfortable connections unfold in Mark's drawing, lines spooling out.
BCCI, which is an Arab-owned bank that was essentially incorporated in Luxembourg, operated worldwide, and was, the mother of all bank scandals. Something like $14 billion disappeared in the process.
To my knowledge, it is the first time that a government agency has ever used a work of art for verifiable information. So it represents a whole nother stage in terms of the role art can play in terms of political events.
We asked the FBI to clarify the reason for their visit to the Whitney in 2001. They did not respond to requests for comment.
Mark was a priest trying to find what high art was.
I wanted to tell a detailed story, a story perhaps that had some dark passages to it.
He was making connections that were insidious and powerful and suggested an unknown currency of power and authority that the public was unaware of. Behind the beauty of the mark on the page was an extraordinary vision a dystopian vision of power. Often you have a political work which is very direct, blunt, and wants your attention. For Lombardi, it was human scaled. It was a whisper.
It is a cold February evening, and Mark Lombardi is just entering his New York apartment, having spent another night out with the up-and-coming artists of the city. Most are half his age, and see him as a mentor. But he doesn't see himself as one. Out there, he commands a room, intensely intelligent, driven by an urge to prove what kind of world we really live in.
Connected people on the board of the initial development company.
In his own home, the mask drops. Now that he's tasted success with a few solo exhibitions, he craves more. The brilliant man everyone knows him to be disappears behind closed doors. And what is left is the Mark that directs a single vicious accusation at himself. Who am I?
Can I take a break for a minute?
But Mark has a solution. He's been working on it for years, working on something big. He takes a drag of his cigarette and something curious jolts him out of his daydream. A change in his apartment. The chaos he normally works around, altered. At first he sees the rolls of papers. They look stained. The usually pristine white paper is now brown. Nervous, he moves towards them. He feels a drip on his nose. He looks up. He can't catch his breath.
I mean, like a drawing, like the BCCI drawing that I did, I think I went through, there's like 300 elements.
Something impossible has happened. Something terrible.
There was a sprinkler accident, and his drawings had gotten wet, and he had this big show coming up.
The sprinkler system has soaked his work. His BCCI masterpiece is ruined.
I have to like keep it ball rolling.
Wet paper, blurred names. His work, his lifeline, destroyed. Coming up on the next episode of The Illuminator.
Aren't you worried about somebody, shutting you up?
There are people out there that are convinced that he pissed off the wrong people.
I asked him one day, why don't you just take the subway? And he was afraid to ride the subway.
The Illuminator is a production of Brazen. It's hosted by me, Akko Mitchell. Farah Halim is the showrunner and scriptwriter. Zuben Kem is the reporter and associate producer. Megan Dean and Charlie Barlow are story editors. Ian Chambers is senior producer, sound designer, and composer. Claire Urbarn is the production manager. Mariangel Gonzalez is senior producer and project manager. Ryan Ho is creative director, and Julien Pradier is the cover art designer. Additional design by Andrea Claridge. Lucy Woods is head of research, and Arnav Benaikia is fact checker. Bradley Hope and Tom Wright are executive producers. Mark Lombardi interview excerpts are sourced from the Andy Mann Video Archive, courtesy of media arts organization Aurora Picture Show. Subscribe to Brazen Plus to listen to ad-free episodes. For other amazing stories, please follow us on Instagram at brazen.fm, on X at brazenfm, or go to our website, brazen.fm.